Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see so many people with us tonight. I want to welcome you all to our third annual Social Justice Symposium sponsored by the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and also sponsored by the Restorative Justice Collaborative at UNCW. We are glad to have you here. And we're especially glad to have an opportunity to celebrate Black History Month and share this panel discussion with you on remembering truth and reconciliation as a path forward, ? This is not a dictation of what should happen. This is an invitation to discuss what can happen. So I want to introduce our panelists today. And also a technical piece of advice. If you're interested in asking questions, please look at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A box. And you may go ahead and insert your question in the Q&A box, and that will be monitored by me and by Janique Penny, who is a graduate student in our department and is our helper for the evening, and I'm so grateful for that. So I want to introduce our panelists. We first have Professor Jeff Ward. Professor Ward is a professor of African and African American Studies. His scholarship examines the racial politics of social control and the pursuit of racial justice historically and today. His current projects examine histories of racial violence, their legacies, and implications for repair. Professor Ward is a founding member of the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis, a community-based organization working to commemorate histories of racist violence and to address their legacies in our region. He is a descendant of Wilmington builder Alfred Howe and is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Next, we will be hearing from Cynthia Brown. Cynthia Brown is a sixth generation descendant of esteemed Wilmington builder Alfred Howe. Her great-grandmother and other relatives were witnesses to the violence perpetrated against Wilmington's African-American community in 1898 here in Wilmington. She's devoted more than 40 years to her career and community service, aiding vulnerable children and families. And we're very pleased to have you with us, Cynthia. Next, we have Ms. Lucy McCauley. Lucy is a filmmaker and writer. Her documentary, Facing the Nazi Era, was screened internationally, and she's a researcher for the upcoming PBS film, The Fire and the Forgotten, about the 1921 Tulsa racial massacre. She's a member of the Wilmington chapter of Coming to the Table, which is a national organization that works towards repairing the harms of historical and institutionalized racism. And she co-facilitated the first chapter in Texas, where she lives today. We also have with us Mr. Cedric Harrison, who many of you already know as well. Mr. Harrison is the executive director of Support the Poor Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to enhance, cultivate, and provide a renewed sense of community, ownership, and excellence for residents of Wilmington, North Carolina. He also created the Wilmington in Color series of coloring books to teach Black history locally, and it's a really amazing series, so definitely keep your eye on that. And finally, we are very fortunate to have the talents of our spoken word poet, Ms. Rhonda Sekhmet Ra. Rhonda is a spoken word artist, organizer, healer, and activist focused on spreading a message of truth, justice, and empowerment through her spoken word poetry. Rhonda was born and raised in the city of Wilmington, where she began writing poetry as a child. In 2014, Rhonda began to share her spoken word on stage as a means of awakening people to the truth about racism and inspiring them to make change. Since then, Rhonda has performed at a number of venues across the East Coast, including in the Carolinas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Rhonda uses her divinely inspired poetry to carry on the legacy of her ancestors, to bring forth the mental, physical, and spiritual liberation of people of African descent. we're very fortunate to have Rhonda with us and have all of you with us as well. And I want to say a few words. I'm Kim Cook. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology and the director of the Restorative Justice Collaborative at UNCW. And I want to thank you all for being with us. Earlier this month, some of you might have listened to a podcast called Criminal. And while I listened to it, and while I was listening to it, I heard these haunting words: something really bad happened here. Cynthia Brown recalled her great-grandmother saying when she was a child. And indeed, something really bad did happen here in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. A white supremacist coup and massacre of African-American residents resulted in the overthrow of a duly elected interracial government. They destroyed businesses of local Black residents, and they proclaimed a white declaration of independence. Historians have not definitively determined how many people were killed in that violence, perhaps as many as hundreds. We know that a thriving Black middle class was leveled, and in that event, our city was a crime scene. The crimes against humanity included this massacre and this political crime of the coup d'etat. And like enslavement before that, it continued the crime scene. Families were torn apart, dismembered, if you will. The communities that once thrived in Wilmington were also shattered and scattered. Memories were lost, family and community connections were severed. Something really bad happened here. It was a collective trauma. Our community is still living in the aftermath of that trauma, searching for ways to heal, if at all possible. In restorative justice practices, we look for ways to repair harms based on the values of making amends and understanding that there is an obligation to repair the harms, and asking the questions: who was harmed? What do they need to feel whole again? Whose obligation is it to address those needs? And how can we support and assist the process of meeting those needs? Historian Anne C. Bailey writes, "If racial reconciliation matters, then memory matters. If honoring your dead matters, then memory matters. If voices of the past can empower those in the present, then memory matters." Our topic for this symposium is to examine the possibility of authentic remembering. We can bring people together who are impacted by this violence. Can we bring people whose families have been dismembered and denied their lives and their livelihood back into community? Do they want to be? Can we continue the work towards healing and repair that started more than 20 years ago with the first, the centennial celebrations and commemorations in 1998 and have continued to this day? We'll hear from our speakers and their views on the harms and what might help repair those harms. And we aim to generate ideas for action steps that can involve community. So we're very glad to have you here. And to start our discussion, let's turn to Professor Ward. Jeff?
Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this important conversation and this panel. I just have a real connection to Wilmington that I didn't know about for very long, honestly, and we could talk more about that later. I want to really respond to the prompt of the symposium, which is remembering as a path forward. The question of whether remembering is a path forward and what remembering means. I'm going to share some images and make a couple of key points along the way. The the key thing I want to probably touch on today is how, more so than my own family story, and I would love to be part of a conversation about family histories in more detail, but I want to talk about the work that me and a number of humanists and social scientists have been doing for a long time now on histories and legacies of racial violence and the question of reckoning, and how this makes me think about the questions the symposium poses. This is a scene from Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when the atrocity we are remembering today profoundly altered this landscape and in its history sense, including for my family, but for everyone in Wilmington then and for everyone in Wilmington now. I want to stress in my remarks today. I'm going to make two key, I guess, arguments. One is that we are implicated in historical trauma, and this is the nature of our responsibility. We're implicated through our inheritance of structural inequalities that are rooted in histories of racist violence. So the Wilmington coup and massacre shaped the structure of inequality in Wilmington, and not for the first time. It is one of many episodes of racialized violence, including related to settler colonialism and Native American dispossession and so many other stories. So this is a chapter in a history of racist violence that creates and sustains patterns of structural inequality. We become implicated in this trauma through our inheritance of this. And I'm going to talk more about that. And then secondly, I'm optimistic that we can, in fact, counter legacies of racist violence through anti-racist memory work, which I think there is some evidence it holds some promise to really transform our national identity and our political culture, particularly through local reparative effort. And by local, I mean local communities, but also at the individual level. The way we understand power and its legitimacy, for example, as a way of thinking about political culture, can be altered through truth-telling and bearing witness. So I want to talk about that as well. First, to the point of structural inheritance, this image many of us have probably seen from this summer, Black Lives Matter movement, is from our nation's capital outside of the White House. Black Lives Matter emblazoned on the street, and it is symbolic of the two things. One is that our nation is a wounded place related to histories of racist violence, and the second key thing about this image I want to stress is that the arts have been so important in moving us towards a greater reckoning with these histories and their legacies. And I want to make some more specific points about the power of the arts here that are really intriguing to me. And I'm glad that the arts are represented in the symposium today in a couple of ways, because I think I'm going to argue it's very important. First, to the point about implication, to elaborate a little bit more on this, this idea that I'm going to emphasize comes mostly from the work of Michael Rothberg, who's a Holocaust memory scholar, currently at UCLA. And he wrote a book recently published called The Implicated Subject, where he's asking us to move away from this binary of victims and perpetrators, and which he argues is unproductive and more importantly inaccurate. It is inaccurate to think about this past in relation to these kind of very genealogically defined categories. Were you personally there or personally affected, or was your family? And I know, there is importance to talking about victims and perpetrators. So the point is not that we should never use those concepts, but he's saying that we've become, we've in that binary, we lose understanding of how we are collectively implicated. And we're implicated, he explains, because we are enmeshed in structures and institutions and webs of ideas that are the product of history. And implicated in the sense that this web of relationships that is rooted in history makes us who we are, even how we understand ourselves in relation to others. And I'll give another example of that in a moment. And this is a kind of, I think, beginning of a way of thinking about this legacy point. But I want to show you some other evidence first before I drill down more on this idea. Rothberg's certainly not the first person to observe the way that the past remains present, and that is, I think, something around which there is growing consensus, which is an important thing in our society. It wasn't long ago that people were very confident in asserting that the past is irrelevant today, and the evidence of this, of course, is clear. The evidence that the past remains present is quite clear, and the understanding has been there for a while. This term, the yoke of history, for example, was coined by the late the classic sociologist Emile Durkheim to explain how populations remain kind of their values, their norms, and so on are guided by historic precedent. And he called this a yoke in the sense of the contraption that you put on a mule or something to guide its movement. And the question that presents us to us, I think, is how do we remove the yoke of history, or at least engage with it productively? But let me show you some examples of the evidence of our haunting, to use that term again that Kim introduced. So this is one of many studies that I'll mention tonight that demonstrates pretty compellingly that we remain impacted by histories of racial violence. In this case, the authors looked at how histories of slavery at the county level, which are shown in the shading of these these cells, relate to subsequent patterns of conflict and inequality and violence in these states. And they found, for example, that net of other factors, these are very complicated social statistical models, that net of other factors, the percent of the population enslaved in 1860 predicts the rate of lynching from 1882 to 1930. It predicts consistently white voter support or opposition to liberal government, liberal candidates for government, consistently over generations from 1850 to 2008. Taking account of things like level of education and income and urban, rural, size of population, all those things held constant. The percent of the population enslaved in 1860, consistently over this vast period of time, is negatively related to the likelihood that white voters will support liberal candidates for office. It is percent enslaved 1860 negatively related to white support for affirmative action at the county level. Positively related to white levels of racial resentment, or in other words, expression of racist attitudes in attitudinal surveys. They find this effect consistently for generations among white Americans in communities historically dependent on the exploitation of enslaved people, and this is in comparison to whites in neighboring areas, so not in like far-flung places of the country, but other parts of these same states where slavery has left less of an imprint on the local political culture. This kind of relationship has been shown constantly for a number of outcomes that various studies have engaged. I'm just going to scroll through these in the interest of time and not talk about them independently. But all of these are contemporary outcomes related to conflict, violence, and inequality in our society that are strongly related to, statistically, to histories of slavery and lynching in particular. One of our recent papers showed that corporal punishment in Southern schools is pretty strongly predicted by the history of lynching in the counties, particularly for Black youth. Every additional lynching in the history of a county, we looked at 12 Southern states, every additional lynching increased the odds that a Black child will be corporally punished in school by about 6% per additional lynching. So in a county with 10 lynchings, that's a 60% increase in the odds that a child, particularly a young African-American child, will be corporally punished in schools today. Again, net of other factors like how religiously conservative the community is, the experience level of teachers, urban rural school, racial composition of the school. And these models look at all these factors and find, with all that taken into account, lynching is a strong predictor still of corporal punishment, not only for Black kids, but especially for Black kids. It is also predicting patterns for white youth. Our most recent paper looked at opioid-related deaths and found that histories of slavery are effectively a protective factor for white opioid death rates, in the sense that in counties distinguished by histories of slavery, the odds that whites will die of opioid related cause are diminished. And all of these are complicated relationships. To go back to corporal punishment, the idea, we think, and the data are not great to parse all this out, we suspect that this is a story of hypervigilance among African Americans in hostile environments that are being captured by the measure we use, that is the history of lynching in the county. In those hostile environments, hypervigilant Black parents, we think, are more inclined to give schools permission to use corporal punishment. And the school officials are more likely to use corporal punishment because of the rationalization of violence, and particularly racialized violence in those places. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about in the Between the World and Me about the ordeal of corporal punishment in his experience. And then he said, our parents love us, almost love us to death, and seem to want to kill us so that other people can't, he says in that piece. And he talks about how this strained his relationship with his father, how it, we know from the corporal punishment literature that there are relationships with things like mental health, adverse mental health outcomes, school, educational attainment, involvement in the criminal legal system. So this would be a mechanism by which a multi-generational cycle of racialized violence contributing to social exclusion or societal dismemberment, to use that term, the way that might work. I'm happy to talk more about these research findings, but I just wanted you to be aware of the evidence that we need to deal with 1898. It's not just a kind of moral consideration. It's something that we should do because it's the right thing to do. It's because people will say, well, they're sort of fanning the flames, making this problem bigger than it was, and the evidence is quite the contrary. The flames are burning. We know this about look at this group of findings. Remember, what these studies are suggesting then is that all of these things are happening in places distinguished by histories of racist violence. So it's a cascade of racialized violence over time that takes many different forms. Another thing I want to emphasize this evening is that while Wilmington's reckoning is critical, and it's critical that Wilmingtonians come together there, I noticed that there is, I think, a sort of lack of connection of the Wilmington case to so many other cases like it on the one hand, but also I think there has to be more of a conversation about the responsibility of the state of North Carolina and the responsibility of surrounding counties, of the county, New Hanover County, but the state of North Carolina, which withheld its protection from Wilmingtonians, from Black Wilmingtonians and progressive white Wilmingtonians who were trying to maintain this model city in the Reconstruction period. The state government withheld its protection of civil and human rights and is implicated because of that. I'm just going to share this is only a small number of the racist pogroms that have targeted Black Americans and not only resulted in untold numbers of deaths, but also profound displacements of population, which is in parentheses at the end of each line. And I'm spotlighting here the region I live in now because I like to point out how close these places are to each other, in part in Missouri, in time, close together in time and space, in Illinois and Missouri. You see Wilmington in 1898. The list goes on and on. I've not included the Colfax massacre. I've not included the Hamburg massacre in South Carolina. These part of what we have to grapple with Wilmington is how earlier events of racial terror made Wilmington possible, in part, not just by demonstrating that you can do this, you can attack people, but in particular demonstrating that there will be impunity for this political violence. My family from Wilmington fled eventually to a part of it. My family fled to Washington, D.C., and from there to Chicago. This is why my mother was born in Chicago and not in Wilmington. And the impact of the Wilmington atrocities and so many of these other ones did not stay in Wilmington. It moved with our family. It moved with all of these displaced people, such that we have to appreciate I think that this history is kind of, we haven't even gotten to Tulsa yet in 1921 in this list, or Red Summer in 1919. The impact of this historic racist violence, I think, could be well described as having kind of metastasized in our political culture. It is so deeply now in our fabric. And we see this resurfacing all the time, most recently in our nation's capital, not down the street from that scene I started out with, the Black Lives Matter intervention, where we have these people whose identities are clearly shaped by this history, including the idea that they have some claim to the nation, that this is a white country still, and they will fight to keep it so. I mean, this was a kind of echoing of the 1898 massacre, and in some ways, literal ways. We have to remember that in 2016, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump spoke in Wilmington and warned that if his opponent was elected, she'll, quote, get to pick her judges and there's nothing you can do, folks. And then he said, quote, although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. In suggesting that perhaps she could just be killed. And that would be a way to effectively protect gun rights. So he told us who he was in 2016 in Wilmington, of all places. Wilmington police recently, shockingly, accidentally recording themselves fantasizing about slaughtering African Americans, are regurgitating this past in a sense, and not necessarily one that they understand. I don't know if Trump's team knew that the irony or the coincidence of the Wilmington reference during their speech. But the fact is, they could have made that speech in many places, like Tulsa or so many others, and it made the same point. This is a map of a Ku Klux Klan rally in Brunswick County, North Carolina, in 1964, and it shows you where the people who attended the rally, where their cars were registered, and we know this because the state police captured license plates and then looked up the registrations, and we had the data set, so we made this map. And one thing I want to show you is New Hanover County's representation here. And so this is 1964. This is Cape Fear Academy, and the former logo for Cape Fear Academy in New Hanover County, which had the mascot Rebels until 2005. In 1967, 3 years after that rally I showed you, Ku Klux Klan leader Lee Shelton bragged about the strength of the Klan in New Hanover County, and how that strength had translated into the ability to fund the reestablishment of Cape Fear Academy as a private segregation academy for white students. In 2005, the student body, I'd love to know more about this, voted to change the school's name to the Hurricanes. Kind of was struck by that choice. Are they seemingly fixated on, like, what other term for destruction can we find? We're going to replace the Rebels. Let's choose some other violent, destructive referent. But the thing I really want to ask about this, and I want to ask about Wilmington, and I'm going to start to wind down here is in what other ways can this school and should this school reckon with its implication in structural racism, not only with current students, but with previous students and with alums and with donors, with faculty and staff. This is a school that was built on the foundation of a commitment to white supremacism, and operated in that way for decades. What else can it do besides change its name? And that is, I think, a question that kind of gets at something I'm going to move to next, which is, what kind of remembering is transformative? And I'm going to argue that that we need to find ways of reparative memory work that really has a sort of affective dimension that pulls people in the sense of being able to feel and understand the importance, the significance of what they're doing and why it is their responsibility to be involved and so on. I noticed that the North Carolina state apparently has introduced some social studies requirements. And I'm curious, how will the state's complicity in Wilmington and other atrocities be addressed in that curriculum, that social studies curriculum? And is this a chance for Wilmington to distinguish itself again as a model city? Wilmington, that was in 1897, apparently, a model city for a multiracial ethnic democracy, what it could look like. Will Wilmington distinguish itself again is a question I'm really curious about, and I would like to be involved in helping with. Okay, the last few points I want to make relate to this idea of monumental anti-racism, which is, we've been in the midst of this commemorative reckoning in this country and around the world, really, with great intensity over the past summer, but for longer than that, particularly around reckoning with Confederate monuments, as in the case here. And I've been really interested in the potential for this kind of anti-racist mobilization to transform our political culture. And I'm going to say why in a moment. But first, just to be clear about what I mean by this term, anti-racism being the commitment of actively opposing, fighting racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And the monumental idea being a kind of twofold notion. On the one hand, a reference to scale, something that is great in importance. As a sociologist, I'm curious, what kinds of anti-racist memory work is great in importance? And what kind isn't? I was really interested to learn about the Wilmington Massacre Memorial and the extent to which it did not seem to really activate, when I was last in Wilmington, to have the kind of resonance that you would want a memorial like that to have as a sort of resource in healing. So how could it be activated further is an interesting question, I think. And then the other use of the term monument is simply in terms of the issue of memory and commemoration. And part of why I'm intrigued by the possibility of anti-racist memory work to be transformative is because it helps us think about implication, what Rothberg calls implication, and how our structural position relates to histories that don't have to be our own. We don't have to know the people who. It doesn't have to be your ancestor who was the slave trader or the leader of the red shirts, but insofar as that event in 1898 created conditions of white advantage rooted in non-white disadvantage in Wilmington, it implicates subsequent residents, even visitors. You don't have to live in Wilmington; just drive through. And you become implicated in the history of that landscape, regardless of your genealogical connection to the past. I might note here, for example, I'm not genealogically related to Wilmington, as far as I know. In fact, my biological ancestors are African-American ancestor is from South Carolina. And there's probably a different Black history there that I don't know about. I wish I did. And but I was adopted into a family and inherited this structure that way. adopted into a family of Wilmington descendants. So the one thing I want to say about this image is how, part of what it's doing, that this anti-racist memory work, in this case, the vandalism of this object is forcing a reckoning with racism that our culture is intent on avoiding. I'm sure, I don't know these young women, these girls, I don't know what they're thinking, but I would be willing to bet part of what they're dealing with is this shocking encounter with the word racist in a culture where they've learned that we don't talk about racism. We don't acknowledge its existence. It's awkward. The best thing to do is just to leave it alone. And here they're encountering an object that is powerfully asking them to do something else. There is some evidence that white disavowal of white supremacism in communities marked by histories of racial violence weakens the relationship between historic violence like lynching and contemporary outcomes like homicide. This study I'm showing you now that has this really funny graphic, it's kind of like a Charlie Brown thing, but what they looked at is whether whites in counties voted for racist candidates for office in the 1960s, particularly Strom Thurmond and George Wallace. And they found that in counties where whites did not retill the soil that way, the soil of white supremacy, the history of lynching was weakened in terms of its predictive effect on subsequent homicide. In counties where marked by histories of lynching, where whites in the 60s then voted for racist candidates for office, the power of lynching to explain homicide remained strong. This suggests to me that we can alter the trajectory of these legacies, and memory work might be another way that this disavowal can be effectively transformative. I don't think any of us would agree, would suggest that simply putting markers up will do that. But really, but the markers create arenas for us to have difficult conversations and to face our history and ourselves together. I think that is their great importance. I mentioned finally, I would just say last couple of things about art, and I want to just recognize the incredible work of the fabric artist Sonia Clark, who's working with, these inherited objects like Confederate battle flags, and she has people in her museum exhibit take a battle flag apart together, and in part to show, to demonstrate how hard it is to take apart the flag. Stitch by stitch, and to sort of invite a reflection on what that means then to dismantle structural racism in our society. And she writes about, and others have written about how this work can be liberating for people who feel kind of bound up with, trapped by this yoke of history. Another of her more recent exhibits is about the Confederate flag of truce or surrender. She calls it monumental cloth, a flag we should know, where she's trying to get us to recognize this flag, which is more important for our republic, our union, than the Confederate battle flag. And in this exhibit in Kansas City, she set up looms for people to come and make more Confederate truce flags so that they can proliferate in our culture and our cultural memory. There are so many ways that memory work can happen and must happen. I'm going to close with one last example, if I can, and it is about my family history. And partly I want to do this because I think when we think about remembering, in Truth and Reconciliation, we have kind of often a limited range of tools in mind, like historical markers or truth commissions. And there are so many important tools in the arts and otherwise. Historic preservation is one of them. And this is the home that one of our, Cynthia and my ancestors, John Harris Howe, built for himself and his family on Castle Street in Wilmington. Beautiful house, 116 Castle. Go by, knock on the door, tell people you heard about it. Don't knock on the door, maybe. But here's what I want to show you about this. I went by there last time I was in Wilmington, And I was struck by the fact that every house on this block had an historic marker placed by the Wilmington Foundation on that side of the street. So to the left of John Harris Howe family home, there's this Brink Goodman house, and it actually mentions John Harris Howe as the builder. John Harris Howe's own home next door, not recognized by the Wilmington Historic Wilmington Foundation. And I don't know the reasons for this. I can imagine some. But the other thing I want to point out about these signs, and these are just some examples from down the street further down to the right of the house, but each one of them, which was really painful for me as a descendant, each one of them tells a story about how long the home stayed in the family. And that, I think, is part of why John Harris Howe's house does not have a marker, because it doesn't have that happy story about secession and inheritance. It is a different inheritance story, but it's the kind of inheritance story we can tell, we should tell, we must tell, and we can tell through things like historic preservation. All of this is about, for me, the idea of processing historical trauma, and the idea that only if and when we work through the trauma, we integrate the historical trauma, can we escape the yoke of history. Gabriel Schwab, another Holocaust scholar, writes that when we fail to process trauma, the subsequent generations inherit the psychic substance of the previous generation and display symptoms that do not emerge from their own individual experience, but from a parent's, a relative's, a community's psychic conflicts, traumata, or secrets. Thus, we become haunted by the ghosts or the unfinished business of a previous generation. So I think that the challenge and the opportunity we have in remembering is to meaningfully process this historical trauma so that we might actually achieve transformative justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was fascinating. Now we will be hearing from Ms. Cynthia Brown, and while she speaks, I will share her slides.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And I want to say good evening to everyone on this symposium tonight, and to thank Dr. Cook for the invitation. I'm very, very pleased and very honored to share this platform with my relative, my cousin, Professor Ward, with my colleagues, both Lucy McCauley and Cedric Harrison. And I want to focus my comments this evening on the Howe family of Wilmington, those who ultimately stayed behind after 1898, but then some moved on. And I want to speak to the issue of resilience against social injustice, because it was their resilience that held these branches of the family tree together, quite frankly. And not just thinking about 1898 in a vacuum, but when I think about the entire traumatic experience that the first African in our family, on my father's side, to arrive on the shores of North Carolina, experienced the trauma of being kidnapped from his home, the trauma of making the transatlantic journey, the trauma of coming to this foreign place, shackled and sold into slavery, and the trauma of enslavement. Just the idea of surviving that experience alone is enough. But I want to take it forward and then speak specifically to 1898. And what you see across the screen right now are just images from that first African's son, Alfred Howe, who both Professor Ward and I are descendants of. And then one of his children, Mary Washington, for whom a preschool is named after here in town. And then just past her image, two of her nieces who had two very distinct experiences during the 1898 insurrection and massacre. Nada McDonald Cotton, who became the first African-American public librarian and was known as the librarian of the colored location here in Wilmington. And her first cousin, Athalia Howe, who was my great-grandmother, who was relegated to service in terms of her station in life, serving as the chief cook for the Parsley family on Masonboro Sound, but who, through her resilience, maintained a vision for progress, a vision for success, a vision for her children and grandchildren to thrive, even her great-grandchildren. And then my father, Dr. James Brown, who, as in the case of earlier Howes, chose not to remain in Wilmington. He tried, but he realized that opportunities availed elsewhere and that his greatest opportunities for success for himself and for his family rest outside of Wilmington, because he just didn't see the opportunities here. So if we could go to the next slide, I want to talk to you just a bit about this family tree. And by all means, please understand, this is a cutaway. And I've attempted to highlight the direct lineage from Anthony Walker, which was his Anglo name, the first African, and his wife, Tina Howe, straight down through Alfred Augustus, his youngest son, Howe, and then William C. Howe, his son, on to my great-grandmother, Athalia, my grandmother, Louise, my father, James, and then my sister, my brother, and I, and did not make space for the children and the grandchildren that we now have. But let's just look at this chart for a moment and think about, in the context of history, what it took to survive all of these generations, and in some cases thrive, but definitely to survive. So the Howe family has been endowed with a very rich family value, first and foremost, of passing along the history, having knowledge, and starting with the first African that we are aware of on my father's side of the family. It was important for him to express all that he could remember to his wife, to his children. There's a long backstory that I won't speak to right now on how he got to the Howe plantation and his marriage, but it was very important that his family understood who he was, where he came from, and despite the trauma that he experienced, why those values instilled in him back in his homeland were important to his survival and theirs. Also, knowledge that was imparted upon him by his father, knowledge that would help him in this strange, cruel, new place to develop a vocation. And that vocation, as fate would have it, as destiny would have it, as God would have it, proved a valuable and invaluable resource for him to mitigate through different circumstances and situations using his application of knowledge. Because that application of knowledge that was imparted upon him by his father allowed him then to build, to provide living quarters for the enslaved on the Howe plantation that were destroyed during hurricanes. And although he didn't realize it at the exact moment, it, under those circumstances, brought some degree of favor for the work and the skill and the craftsmanship that he had. He was wise enough to understand how to use that to negotiate ultimately the freedom that would come to his children. Long after Colonel Howe, at the time he was colonel, he later went on to become a major general, fighting George Washington for our Union. But long after Colonel Howe died, and some of our family information suggests that Colonel Howe freed Anthony and his children, but in fact, we're finding some new evidence, documented evidence, that it was Colonel Howe's wish for the children to all be freed and for his name to be carried forth. And realizing this, Anthony saw opportunities for his children that he might not have experienced, but he felt that in future generations, there would be an advantage, a benefit. Well, when we move down and we continue to think about resilience and the various components of it, William Howe, Alfred's son, was not as successful, nor was he as blessed to pursue the building trades and to be an entrepreneur as were his cousins, his male cousins. However, he used the skills that he learned to work as a cooper on the riverfront, on the wharves. And a cooper was basically a barrel maker, but you had to be skilled in cutting the oak, in carving out the barrels, and in wrapping them with the copper wire so that they would hold up during shipments of goods and supplies. Not only William, but all of the Howe children, whether they were Alfred's children or Anthony's or Pompey's or the other House, enjoyed the advantage of their families' established reputation in town. Alfred was known for being a stellar builder as well as an entrepreneur. And I was told once, by the way, I want to just mention that when I think back on Jeff's presentation, that he was a slave, he was born a slave, he was enslaved until after the war ended. But in fact, we located Alfred in the 1860 U.S. government census, and he was identified as a free man of color. We also have identified, and these documents are on record at UNCW, letters of reference provided to him when he traveled for his work to ensure that he wouldn't be taken as a slave, and that if he needed any assistance or help, to contact the Board of Aldermen in the city of Wilmington to ensure his well-being. So we know, and his children and his family knew of his standing in the community. And because of that, they had self-esteem, something that is typically robbed in the trauma of the enslavement of Africans being brought to America. Well, let's talk for a minute about Athalia, and let's talk about 1898. And I want to share some things with you. And yes, as Dr. Cook indicated, when I was a young child, my mother took me and my brother on a visit to see her when she was ill. Her health was failing. And I don't know, for all that I know, at this point in time, she may have been suffering from some early dementia, although she was in her right mind from all that everyone else in the family could say about her. But Athalia and I had a very close relationship. And before her daughter Louise took her to Pennsylvania to live with her and her husband, when her health began to decline, I would visit with her at her home here, and she would teach me on the steps of her front porch counting exercises with numbers. I was 2 or 3 years old, but I remember her so well and so vividly. She was an active member in our church, a woman of strong faith, and despite her position, as I said earlier, as a cook, as many of her other relatives had gone on and were beginning to thrive, she kept the faith that through family values and through resilience, her children, her grandchildren, and beyond would go on to succeed. If I could see the next slide now, I want to talk a bit about that resilience. In my opinion, the legacy of 1898 is basically the dismemberment, as previously was stated, but I also say the shattering of families. There are many shattered families still here in Wilmington, shattered families, fragments, shards like a broken glass that are all over this country who were affected by 1898 and what happened here. But also, 1898 caused a break in this community. It left a broken community. While the perpetrators, the insurrectionists, felt that they were making Wilmington better, making Wilmington stronger, making Wilmington so great, in fact, their failure to recognize the strength in the diversity of Wilmington caused a traumatic breakdown in the society here. Not only were people of color who were businessmen, physicians, attorneys, tradesmen, architects, builders, you name it, not only were they affected, publishers such as Alex Manley, either through death or through being forced to flee from their homes, the community actually weakened because no longer did Wilmington have the true strength of its diversity, the beauty of everything that everyone could offer. Wilmington was positioned to be the Charlotte of North Carolina. It was positioned to be the Queen City. We were strategically positioned right here on the coast. It was a point of trade and the economy, the industry, the culture was all here. All of the elements to a strong society. But with 1898, we had murder, we had economic and social disenfranchisement, we had fear. And when I say fear, I mean perpetual fear. We had fear by those who fled. We had fear of those who stayed behind and hid in the cemetery. We had not just loss of property, we had theft of property, in my opinion, because through some very strategic and very, I don't want to say diabolical, but I'll say strategic and very well thought out evil plans, in my opinion, property was taken from members of this community illegally. There was a loss of knowledge of self, which caused a loss of self-esteem because these fragmented families who did suffer loss of family members began to lose contact one with the other, and thereby they lost the chain of custody on family history. I have a friend and colleague here who speaks periodically of a relative who left Wilmington after the 1898 insurrection and didn't return until many decades later for a funeral of a family member. And immediately after the funeral, he left. There was no desire to be here. And in losing that desire to be here, some family connections were lost. And then, of course, there was loss of good mental health. For those who stayed, I strongly believe there was a determination made to do whatever it would take to survive, to put your faith and your confidence in the next generation, and to walk a very quiet line until there was hope that could be seen off on the horizon. Next slide. So, in a very summarized way, I've attempted to share with you some of the attributes that built the resilience in the various branches on the Howe family tree. Faith, and you see an image on your screen of the original home that was built by Alfred Howe. That was the family homestead, which still stands here in Wilmington. It was the gathering place, and it was the place of safe haven, not just the home, but the city block, actually. Other relatives lived on that block, and on the night of November 10th, the members of the family who lived on the south side of Wilmington there at 3rd and Queen were protected by their neighbors and their friends. People like Mary Washington Howe, who was just a school teacher who went on to become a principal. Young children like Nada Cotton, who went on into the 20th century to grow up and write about that night and what she could recall. On the north side of Wilmington, in the community that we refer to as Brooklyn, my great-grandmother, Athalia, witnessed a man from the window of her home being shot. And in fear, and I would imagine traumatized as a young teenager, she went to her mother, who then gathered her up with her younger sister and went out to try and, sometime shortly thereafter, try and find other women and children on their block. And they ran to escape, going to St. Stephen AME Church, which you'll see at the bottom under the house to the right. But they saw that the church was under siege because the pastor of the church at the time, Reverend Lee, had been confronted when he tried to stop the red shirts in the street, and he was threatened with being killed. So Reverend Lee and some of the officers of the church were under siege, and the women, trying to protect the children, ran to Pine Forest Cemetery. And there they hid for several nights with very little food, sleeping on the cold ground, probably damp, and fortunately able to live despite the trauma. So they persevered, they endured. And as they resurfaced, it was through community networks and through collaborations that they were able to go forward. You'll see also St. Mark's Church in the bottom corner there. And that was the church of Alfred Howe and many members of the Howe family. But you will find in studying the Howes of Wilmington that they surfaced not only in St. Stephen AME Church, but also in St. Luke's AME Zion. And so what do I think about resilience and how this all relates to what has occurred in Wilmington, but still exists today in not only Wilmington, but in our country, in our world, actually? I believe, as a member of this family, when I reflect on our history, which lives with me, I believe that we first need to acknowledge the truths. And I thank a longtime family friend, Mrs. Bertha Todd, Wilmington resident, who opened that Pandora's box. She led a group of community leaders, and together they opened the Pandora's box back in 1998 to reveal many ugly truths about what happened in Wilmington. And through the commemoration at the 100th anniversary of the event, of lives lost and other losses that occurred, a dialogue began. I think there still needs to be acknowledgement of truths, because I believe that there are some in the community here and elsewhere who don't accept those truths. They don't want to acknowledge them. And that is a first step that must be taken. My father would say, if he were here tonight, as a medical doctor, that when you have a bad wound, Cynthia, and let me put a pin there, as my son would say, and I'm the only non-scientific one of the siblings, but he would say to me, when you have a wound, you first must take a close look at it, open it up, clean it out, and acknowledge what's there, because you can't just Band-Aid it and expect it to heal properly. And so that must happen. It must continue to happen. And that knowledge of what happened must continue to be brought forth. The story must be told over and over, no matter how uncomfortable it is, until the truth's acknowledged. But then we must see a commitment to repair this damage. Without a commitment to make a repair, you see, we can talk, and we can talk, and we can talk into perpetuity, but we don't have a firm commitment, individual to individual, family to family, leader to leader, legislator to legislator, to restore that which has been lost and to repair the damage. And I believe respect is at the core of all of this. Until we can respect diversity and understand that together, all of those pieces of colored glass in those plates in the diagram represent the diversity of any community. Until we can respect what each piece brings to the community, we won't fully understand the strength that we have in our communities. We often hear people talk of tolerance. Well, I don't like that term because it's not about tolerating one to the other. It's about respecting our strengths and working together so that entire communities can be strong. And so in my closing comments, I want to share with you something on this final slide that I have used with my Girl Scout troop. And it's a quote about diversity. And so I'll switch gears for a moment from the broken, beautifully colored glass and the shards that are left behind to a tapestry. And I think of tapestry, woven fabrics, but I quilt and I think about bringing together various colors and designs to see the beauty of a creation. And as you can see here on the screen, it basically reads, we should all know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, that we must understand that all the threads in the tapestry are equal in value, no matter what the color. Well, our scouts participate in World Thinking Day with our local council, and World Thinking Day is a Girl Scout event that's designed to help young girls appreciate diversity, understand past wrongs where diversity hasn't been appreciated, and to embrace diversity. We last year undertook a study of the country of South Africa and the struggles that the indigenous South Africans went through during periods of colonialism and apartheid. And we presented our exhibit, and this was a closing takeaway from our exhibit to remind other girls and their parents and the community in attendance of what it takes to have a strong tapestry. I would contend, and I say to you tonight, from the personal note, that without a resilient nature, we as a people won't survive the new face of racism, the institutional racism, the systemic racism that still exists in our society. So we must embrace the components of resilience because although it's been a long time, it is still taking time to address these issues and resolve them and restore that which has been lost. We don't have forever, everyone. We have struggled. I think about my life, and I hope that I have decades more to go. But when I reflect on what happened on January 6th, 2021, I say to myself, is this the shape of the country that my children and my grandchildren will inherit from me after I lived through the civil rights era, after my forebears lived through kidnapping and transatlantic transport trauma, enslavement, 1898, and even in the 20th century, when I felt that with education, experience, some degree of wisdom, I would think, imparted upon me by family, that we still went through civil rights era, and here we are with a failed coup on January 6, 2021. Oh, but if it had turned out as the successful coup did 123 years ago in Wilmington, where would we be? So there is much work to be done. There's so much that I could say about the Howe family that I didn't even begin to touch upon, but I wanted to share these thoughts and perspectives in follow-up to my cousin's more scholarly presentation on racism in America and the world. And I hope for all of our sakes that we will all make a renewed commitment to put a stop to this in our lifetimes and to restore and make our community whole. And I thank you for having me on the panel tonight.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. Next, we will hear from Ms. Lucy McCauley, who will be sharing a special message for us. Lucy, you need to unmute.
Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this symposium and in such distinguished company. I want to welcome my family members who are tuning in as well from various parts of the country, and thank you for being here. Almost 3 years ago, in June 2018, I watched Christopher Everett's documentary, Wilmington on Fire, for the first time. That is when and how I learned about the role that my great-grandfather, William Barry McCoy, played in the events of November 1898. Just a few months later, I attended a week of commemorations on the 120th anniversary of 1898. One of those events was a screening of Wilmington on Fire, and it was at St. Mark's Church, that one of the churches Cynthia was just mentioning on Grace Street. And I was invited to address the audience there. And I'd now like to read to you from an edited version of what I read that night. Before the research conducted by Kent Chatfield for Wilmington on Fire, our family name had not been included among the other perpetrators of the historic white on black massacre in this town. I've examined the archives myself and can confirm that William Barry McCoy was a director of the White Government Union in Wilmington and a property attorney for a local bank. And just a few days before the massacre, he gave a public speech at a rally that helped to incite the red shirt mob into action. No doubt what we now know is still likely only half of it. I can't ask forgiveness from my great-grandfather. And I'm aware that an apology wouldn't begin to get at what's needed to address the depth of the wrongs committed more than a century ago and all the injustices that came before then and since that time. As a start, however, I wanted to acknowledge my ancestors' role in the destruction and lawlessness of that day. But more, I want to confront with you all its painful legacy, which continues today. The long silence about the truth of the massacre in my own family, in Wilmington, and throughout the United States served to multiply exponentially the original harms done and to aid and abet a white supremacist culture. What was lost is something we can never fully grasp or calculate. The toll only begins with the destruction of the Black community and its citizens' property, livelihoods, and civil rights. Those losses accompany a long list of others, the kinds of tangibles and intangibles that pass down through generations of descendants and enable better, more secure lives. Things such as inherited wealth, a voice in community politics, and quality education, housing, and healthcare. All told, the compounded dispossession of our African American brethren is incalculable, and is the continued collateral impairment to Wilmington and all its inhabitants. I believe deeply, as I think many of us do, that we are all connected, and that we cannot separate one group's rights and privileges from another group without harming the whole. And while it's true that many people with my skin color did not choose the families we were born into, we have nevertheless benefited by being part of those families in ways we can't begin to calculate or fully articulate. Fortunately, as the writer Walter Mosley tells us, we are free to change. We are not trapped or locked up in these bones. To interrupt the cycle of harm that perpetuates today, we can choose to address the injustices of the past that continue to reverberate in Wilmington. Some very important changes have already occurred in this town because people have worked together to make that happen. And those deserve acknowledgement, even as we understand that there's so much more to be done. So my question is, how can people who look like me, especially those of us whose ancestors were responsible for the 1898 massacre, move beyond our individual discomfort, our immense feelings of guilt and shame, to do the work that's still needed? How can white people make ourselves truly accountable as individuals and as a group to redress past harms and transform current injustices? How can we work to dismantle the many levels of racism on which our public systems and institutions have been built? As an individual, I have little to offer to directly correct the harms done by my ancestor and his cohorts, but I want to declare my personal willingness to participate in a restorative justice process with this community. And I will continue to help further transformative work that you are already in the midst of in groups like Coming to the Table, the Community Remembrance Project, Black Lives Matter, and others. I believe that change begins in such groups of individuals through truth-telling and uncomfortable conversations, person to person. For whites, that means acknowledging past wrongs and their consequences at both a personal and societal level. It means examining our own embedded and often unconscious racism and assumptions of white privilege in our daily interactions. And it means helping to restore some sense of tangible justice, long overdue, to the parts of the community that were cut off in 1898. Toward that end, I've begun with a small step, working with the Howe family on a strategy for making personal reparations in a meaningful way. We'll be able to share details as they're ironed out, but basically it will be a scholarship fund that I hope many of us in Wilmington will want to contribute to. Following through on the changes that are still needed will take all of our commitment and love for one another to stay the course. But it's a process that might just ripple outward to become a virtuous cycle of mutual support, growth, and opportunity for all. And perhaps by facing the problems together, we might begin to inch towards some measure of true healing for this city at last. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Lucy. That was very moving. Mr. Harrison, would you care to share some thoughts?
I've been trying to pinpoint what thoughts to elaborate off of. It's been a lot of dialogue or just a lot of information put out there in the past hour and a half. I'll just share a few thoughts. I'll try to make it wrap up. I know some of them will be in different spaces, but I'm gonna try to bring them together. As I was just listening, as I think it was Miss Cynthia Brown talking about the Daily Record, and how it was burnt down. I just wanted to use that moment and really break it down for a second of like the reality of how it came to that. The Daily Record wasn't a standalone space. When it was burnt down, it was occupying an office of a bigger annex building. And it moved to this location specifically because it was it was already being harassed by white supremacists. They were downtown on Front Street and moved more closely to the Black community to feel more safe. And it is an exact example of the same type of energy that happens to Black people right now currently, to where white people don't really understand what is really happening to Black people until it truly hits the fan. But people are going through day-to-day issues, running away from white supremacy around Wilmington, still trying to strive and stay close to the community. But nobody really wants to put their arms around these people, put their support around these people, and uplift these people, and more so try to do everything within their means and power to not elevate these people. And so I almost didn't want to have any remarks to be said because I'm almost sure I'm tired of talking. As after we get done talking, it's certain people that get up tomorrow and continue to walk. And that walk is still very lonely compared to all of the people that are here for the conversation. And I guess I would just challenge people to stop having the conversation around people that you're comfortable with and start moving in very uncomfortable spaces. That's going to be the fastest way to learn how to move this process. And then another thing is, don't take too much time to try to learn about how you can make amends of the past by learning the tolerance and the strength of Black people, and more so focusing that energy on the violence of your white counterparts and your white family members, and learning how the evolution of white violence has been able to transform into political structural power, and how they don't have to go to your house with tiki torches and guns and nooses anymore to hang you, when they have so many other means and other capabilities of being able to do that through law, through the healthcare system, through the education system, so many other financial barriers. It's just so many different examples that I could go to. And there's nothing that white people need to do that they need to create. There's Black people that are already doing things that just need to be elevated. And there is spaces and room for you to be able to provide resources, to provide your time, and not even just finances, but like your connections, your reach, your access. There's people that you can be able to align yourself with now and build on actual racial relations while actually walking through the steps of improving the overall life of Black people and the white people that are surrounded around this as well. So as I appreciate some of the ones that are just now starting to come to conversation, or people that are very engaged in conversation, but as Black and brown people continue to die every day, there's some people that aren't trying to slowly but surely make this process happen. There is, as many people get preached about around the Martin Luther King aspect, the Black Power movement came in a headbutt against what Martin Luther King's dream was, because Martin Luther King's dream was for the future. And it was people like Stokely Carmichael that was dealing with the reality of today. And so as we all, as white people have definitely, especially in the education system, pushed us to all be like Martin Luther King, a lot of the things that he asked for and wanted, he wasn't even allowed to be able to see. And that's not the type of reality that we're trying to do now today. 1898 was 100 years ago when Bertha Taft brought it to the forefront. And so now it's passed over 100 years. There's no reason, there's no excuses And there's like this silent racist effect around Black people that are actually making impact and actually giving results. There's a bunch of tables around funding, which is a main thing that could help change the dynamics of how this city is looked at. And there's always certain people at the tables around funding that are never at the table around doing the real work. And there's conversations that we're not having. And there's people like myself that usually don't get on these platforms and say these type of things because there's definitely racial repercussions that still happen in this town. And so for anybody that's here that's on this conversation, you've never seen a movie like Just Mercy, or you've never seen a movie like Judas and the Black Messiah that just came out. Stop coming to these certain things looking for Black people to educate you when you can go out there and do your own education already. Once you come to certain Black people that are already in these spaces, you should be ready to work, not ready to talk, because we're working. And it takes time away from our work to try to sit down and talk with you and educate you, especially when people don't want to value our intellectual property of what it's like dealing with this stuff on a day-to-day basis. People pay environmentalist consultants for information all day long, intellectual property all day long, but just want to pay a Black person, just want to pay for their meal over lunch to hear about their expertise of their experience and how they've been able to navigate these troubled waters. And so I'll stop there with that, and I'll just go into shamelessly plugging that Support the Port is definitely pivoting right now to being more active with the shuttle tour that we're about to launch with Wilmington in Color. And we are looking for a lot of people that are looking to help with providing resources, connections, and access. There's already walking tours available. There's already history available. There's already websites with information out there. There's not anything that a white person needs to create now. I think there's things that they need to start building around that are already existent, that are already in existence. There's a freedom school that NAACP works. There's there's community farms. There's big initiatives. There's big projects going on. Economic development centers, business accelerators. Ask the right people and you can get put in the right place. And I just really challenge people to as much as we all love a good old intellectual conversation, let's put some boots on the ground and really get some real work done, because it's people's lives, people's livelihoods are depending on this. So it's not something to drag our foot on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cedric. I think it's really important for us to understand the urgency of now, which has been urgent for quite some time and will remain a high priority for this community for a long time. So thank you, Cedric, for keeping it real. Next, we will hear from Rhonda Sekhmet-Ra, who has 2 poems she would like to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And this picture in the background is actually my great-great-grandmother, Frances Perkins Williams. She was actually alive during 1898. I have no idea how she dealt with it or her experience. But I share this poem in honor of those who lost their lives during the 1898 massacre, and also those who survived. And this first piece I'm going to share is called 1898 Was a Massacre. Wealthy white men gather to figure out what to do about the Black problem. When Blacks have businesses and political power, all of a sudden, it's a problem. Terrorism was your solution. Murder was justified in your eyes. 1898 was a massacre. 1898 was a massacre like Rosewood and Tulsa. Black power was a threat, so you killed her. Killed men, women, and children, ran us in the swamp to die. No one left to testify. Black bodies in the river. Fear ran through our spines like shivers. Ran grown men out of town. Burned Black businesses down. Now the city wonder why we don't have any, and why monuments dedicated to 1898 terrorists still exist today. A city celebrates its heroes, so what does that say? Still no reparations or healing for the descendants, hardly the morality to ask for forgiveness. Instead, they twist the numbers, manipulate, give euphemisms for cold-blooded murder. 1898 was a massacre. 1898 was a massacre, and we still have not healed. And this next piece I'm going to share is called What Should I Do? What should I do? Should I fall on my knees and beg for you to save me? Should I stand with open arms pleading to join with you? Tell me, what should I do? Should I cover my eyes and pretend like I don't see what you do to me? Or should I drop my hands, shrug my shoulders, and pretend like I don't care? Or do I dare raise my fist in the name of revolution until someone puts a bullet in my head and I'm dead? Should I sail the 7 seas looking for someone who will ally with me? Or should I speak words and words and words and words and words and words until someone shuts me up because they decided they've had enough? Tell me, what should I do? 40 centuries, 4 centuries, 40 decades, 400 years. And they tell me that the struggle is over and I don't have to fight no more. Well, if that's the case, why do I smell the stench of death and deceit every time I walk outside my door? Why is it that I'm cursed for having open eyes in a world where everyone else's are closed, and I'm scorned for speaking the condition of my people that I know? How can I battle an enemy unseen? How can I say fight for justice if you don't even know what I mean? As they tell me what I say isn't even true. Then tell me, what should I do? Well, I tell you what I won't do. I won't fall on my knees and beg for you to save me. I'll save myself. I won't stand with open arms pleading to join with you. If you don't want me there, I'll turn somewhere else. I won't turn a blind eye to injustice and defend it with excuses that were made before I was born as the nation teaches scorn against my people. I will not simply eat my meals peacefully as a quarter of my people live in poverty, not knowing where their next meal is coming from, scorned at the welfare office with nowhere else left to run. I will not simply take my piece of success and go to my job peacefully as my brothers and sisters are incarcerated unequally, working in prisons for free in the most modern accepted form of slavery. I will not sit here and act like racism doesn't exist as bullet holes are put in black bodies at rates similar to war. I swear, I can't take no more. I will not ignore the psychological and social oppression I face every day. They say if I could hold hands with a white person, then I'm free. But the truth is I'm holding hands with a white person while there are shackles all over me. There's shackles on my wrist. There's a shackle on my mind. There's a muzzle on my mouth as you tell me not to speak, but they say I'm free. Freedom has no partiality. I will not let my freedom be defined and dictated by the misinformed and the unoppressed. It is the informed and the oppressed who know oppression at its best. I will not wait for some white savior to rescue me from my black condition. I will not wait for another black leader to get killed in repetition. I will not wait for someone to save me, because if I do, I will never be free. And neither will you, until you realize the truth and stop believing a corrupted nation's lies disguised to be the American dream. I promise you, this ain't what it seems. And until you realize that, you either cover your eyes, fall on your knees, or shrug your shoulders. But either way, you still suffer, my brother. Black and white, we all suffer when we accept what's wrong over what is right. A surge of negativity is a curse of a nation, too corrupted, too afraid, and too blind to correct its mistakes. Happiness is what's at stake. Happiness for you and happiness for me, because we are all connected in ways we can't even see, in God and the universe, and our failure to accept that connection is our curse. If you care more about materialism in the form of money, cars, and clothes, you will never know that which can truly set you free. To save the lives of others is to save your own, but if you won't do it, I'll do it on my own. You see, I'd rather die fighting for freedom than pretend I'm free. I'd rather see the horde with open eyes than walk through the horde blindly. I'd rather be persecuted for preaching truth than praised for promoting lies. I'd rather live as my true self than live my whole life in disguise. Oh God, I promise to never again foolishly accept that which is untrue. And all I can do is hope the same for you. We must stop believing the television's lies and the words on the lips of those who have no clue, and ask our inner, most deepest selves what we can and what we should do. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Your poetry is so powerful. I really appreciate you. I appreciate all of you for being here. I want to, oops, hang on just a second. Here we go. I want to thank Vernon Haley, who is our tech person, who I'm going to ask if it's possible to put our audience members on the screen now, if that's something that we can do, and just have the grid of all of us together. I don't even know if that's possible. So I have 2 invitations to extend to everybody. One is to enter your questions in the Q&A box. And the other is captured on this slide, these slides. So I want to thank you all for being here, and the conversation will continue for a little while longer. But I have a new project that I'm beginning, which I'm calling the Remembering Project. And I want to invite descendants of the 1898 families to reach out, and other people who are connected through this network of social institutions and location here. If you're interested in participating in the project, I'd like to have an initial conversation and decide if participating fully is helpful to you. I want to invite you to participate in the Wilmington chapter of Coming to the Table, which Lucy McCauley mentioned earlier. It is co-facilitated by Frankie Roberts and me, and you can reach out to us either on the Coming to the Table website or through the email address that's on your screen. And I want to invite you to, if you don't know a lot about the details of what happened in 1898 and the continuing relevance of 1898 in our city, I want to invite you to explore that in a website whose URL is on the screen that my students in social justice last semester compiled on the basis of a group project to explore the continuing importance of 1898 in the city of Wilmington and the urgency of now. So I just want to say it's now time for Q&A, and I'm grateful for all of you being here. And I hope that we can answer your questions. There's one message in the chat box. It should be gallery view now. Thank you. And we have a question from Jan Davidson in the Q&A box. When Professor Ward was speaking, Jan asked, I don't know if anyone on the call would be interested, but you can see the 1970 Cape Fear Academy yearbook tellingly called The Rebel Yell, and she inserts a website on that. So the Cape Fear Museum, where she is the historian, recently worked with UNC to digitize the high school yearbooks from prior to 1970. And she inserts the link in that if you are interested. So thank you. And Joe, thank you for putting that in the chat box. If you are interested in Rhonda's poetry, there is the link to her poetry. It is such a powerful art form. Are there other questions, comments? Reactions? Need to process? I don't think I've ever seen a symposium that didn't have questions. Oh, here's another. Rich Cooper, I thought hearing from the participants was powerful and gives us lots to reflect upon. Thank you, Rich Cooper. Jamie Pond, thank you for this opportunity. Angela Dickey, who's one of my friends from Coming to the Table. Thanks for a terrific program. I learned so much. Bravo.
Kim, I would like to hear more about the Coming to the Table petition for reparations and whether there's any response.
I will put the link to that in the comment box for people who are interested in supporting our petition for reparations. I just need to get to that screen on my computer. We have, at our local chapter of Coming to the Table, has launched a petition in support of Wilmington establishing a process for reparations here in New Hanover County. And the link is going in the chat box for anybody who is interested in reading the petition and potentially signing the petition as well. We are urging the city to have a conversation around restoring the property, restoring the multicultural city that we once had, and restoring a sense of wholeness and a sense of healing, creating something new. You know, we can't change the past, but we can inform the future in a way that is more dignified and create that level of respect that Cynthia was talking about, and create that sense of where should I go that Rhonda was reflecting on, those questions about which way do I turn in this absolutely horrendous conundrum of pressures and fears and anxiety, and yet talents that have to be expressed and need to be expressed and ought to be expressed. So I just want to acknowledge that we need to do concrete things. We need the urgency of now to be the concrete things that inspire us to move this forward, to support the leaders in our Black community who are doing amazingly great work, such as Cedric, such as Rhonda and Rhonda's mother, Sonia, such as Vance Williams and Frankie Roberts, and so many people in our community who are doing amazing work, Tracy Ray and Kim Caesar, and a variety of people who are in the work trying to create a better city for us and a better county. Yes, Cedric.
The Wilmington Journal that was just
yes,
it's a perfect example, you know, of connecting the past with the present. You know, the Wilmington Journal was just able to reach their goal of the fundraising amount that they needed to keep the title in their name, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to that establishment. As we talk about the things that have happened to the Daily Record have been attempted on the Wilmington Journal, and you can still see it when you look at it to this day. I think it's a direct connection for those that are definitely trying to get involved. I would definitely point you on the finger towards the Wilmington Journal, and there's still original members of the Wilmington 10 around too, as well.
yes. And I want to point to a question that's in the Q&A box from Stuart Barrett. Is there more information about the scholarship that Lucy mentioned? And is this different or part of Coming to the Table project? It's separate from Coming to the Table, and we don't yet have a full slate of information. The details are still being ironed out. When those details are completely ironed out, we will be, of course, announcing it on a variety of platforms. And so watch this space for more information on that. Rich Cooper asks, is there a truth and reconciliation movement in the city, which the city government supports? And if not, can we pressure the city to do this? Rich Cooper, if people didn't know better, they would think that I planted you in the audience. This has been a topic that I've been wanting for the city of Wilmington to address for quite some time. A couple of years ago, there was opinion piece in the local paper about that very thing. And it has not gone anywhere, so it has not gained traction yet. If you want to collaborate on that, we can be in touch. Email me at restorativjustice@uncw.edu, and we can have that conversation. And you can also join our chapter of Coming to the Table, and we can have that conversation there as well.
Oh, one more shameless plug, or just a mention. There's the Grand Masonic Lodge here in Wilmington is one of the most historical African American lodges. As we talk about Rich, thanks Rich for making that comment, because it made me realize that is a 3-story building that was built by Blacks. That is one of the longest still standing establishments built by African Americans, and it's in terrible condition in the city state. It's not doing anything to help keep it up. So yes, Rich, apply pressure, please.
This is going to sound maybe like I'm speaking out of school, but one of the dreams that's been going on in my brain for a long time, and I don't know how it would go over, to have an Alex Manly School of Journalism established here. I think that, but of course it would require a conversation with Alex Manly's descendants to be involved in shaping that, to be deeply and intimately involved in shaping that, if they are interested in such an idea. But that's just a pipe dream on my part. There's so many things that we can do to make the city a better place. After the January 6th insurrection, and there was so much news coverage about the similarities between what happened on January 6th in DC and the 1898 massacre and coup here in Wilmington. I really wished that the news reporters had been able to tell a story of Wilmington truly making amends. That yes, the horror happened in 1898. Yes, families were shattered and it was terrible, and the long-term impact has been awful. And yes, Wilmington is trying to make it right, and here's how. That last piece of it hasn't been able to be told as much as it could be. I don't want to discredit all of the great work that people like Bertha Todd and others have been doing to raise level of awareness. I don't want to overlook all of the hard work that went into the centennial and the memorial and the historic markers and all of the things that have been going on in the city for so long. We're still not ready to say Wilmington has done that next step. Cedric, were you about to say something? Did I interrupt you? No. Okay. Cynthia.
Yeah, I would like to say that I totally agree with you, and it's not to take away from any work that was done in commemorating what occurred. That was a step. This is a process. And my frustration is that this process, let me stop. This whole evil that causes these problems throughout history, these situations throughout history, is almost like a virus that's mutating. It takes on a different shape, but it comes back around if the steps are not taken to intervene, to stop it before it can come back around. So I don't take your comment as a takeaway from what Bertha Todd and others did to commemorate. The commemoration was necessary. It doesn't put, as far as Cedric's comments, and I agree with him, it doesn't put boots on the ground right now, today, making reparations right now, today. But unfortunately, so much time has been lost, and people are so weary with the process that seems to keep repeating itself until, of course, there's frustration now. As I said, to think back over all of my life for the years that I've been here. And I'll take this moment to say, on my mother's side of the family, I am a direct descendant of 3 women who have just died suddenly in this beginning of the 6th decade of their lives from either heart disease or sudden heart attacks without any warning. And I've exceeded that lifespan. But yet I think every day about my children, my grandchildren, my siblings, my brother, my sister, both of whom have a child. And I think about what will they inherit after all that our ancestors have endured, all of the struggles to overcome. And here we are now at a pinnacle in terms of civilized humankind, and we're still savage. The savagery has evolved to a different level. And so I don't want to leave this place when it's my time to check out of planet Earth, as I tell my friends, with it being in the condition that it's in socially, politically, economically, for my children, for other people's children and grandchildren, because the suffering never should have occurred, but yet it did. They persevered one way or the other, and it's time for the change to occur. So I see what you're saying. I see what Cedric's saying. And I would say, to bring that together, it's a process. It's just that we now have an urgent need to make this process work more expediently. Time passes rapidly. And if we're not careful, our children will inherit an environmentally sick planet. Our children will inherit a socially wicked society that will continue to harm, maim, injure, kill, disenfranchise those who don't look like those who are in power. And so, because we're in that generation, but for such a time as this, as the Bible would say, we're at a place where now we've been prepared. We have the knowledge. Pandora's box was open. And so for those who knew and didn't tell it or couldn't tell it, for those who didn't know and now they have the knowledge, we have an ability, if we're just as strategic and as committed as those who would perpetrate the injury, we have the ability to bring about the change in this lifetime. And I, for one, feel it must happen. It must. If we have any hope for our future, it must happen. And so I hear what you're saying, and yes, I don't take it as an offense when you speak of the work that was done by those before us. And Cedric, I don't take it as an offense when you say boots are needed on the ground now, because I see the coming together of both sides of that discussion. Just know that there is an urgency. It needs to happen. Our children are depending on it. Our grandchildren, the generations we can't even see, are depending upon us. And if we don't consider that call, that clarion call to action while we're here and we're able to talk, but then act, then the atonement doesn't occur. Not in our lifetimes, I don't think. But those are just my feelings.
Thank you so much. There's another comment in the Q&A from McKinley Brown to Cedric. I want to say to Mr. Harrison that I enjoyed his perspective on this topic. It is a shame that we are having the same type of dialogue that we had 50 years ago. Slavery has a deep and far-reaching consequence. Thank you, McKinley Brown, for that comment. And Jamie Pond also offered a comment, particularly as Cynthia, in relation to what Cynthia has been talking about. She writes, as I think about tonight's discussion, I could not help but think of this quote by James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time from 1963. Baldwin states, quote, "White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed." That's an interesting quote from James Baldwin. Thank you, Jamie, for offering that up. Any other comments before we close for the evening?
Well, I would like to speak in defense of talking and not in the absence of action. But the reality is that, Angela Davis's book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, makes the point that we don't get to this point where we're just kind of fixing it. We work through dialogue and action informed by dialogue to advance freedom. And it's not an end point. It's a constant struggle. There's another version of this that's of a book called Freedom is a Constant Meeting, because it requires that we constantly are taking stock of the situation we find ourselves in and the lessons we can learn. I mean, Cynthia's points about the lessons we can learn about resiliency. Well, part of what I loved about what you shared, Cynthia, was how it helped us unpack the class dynamics. And this is also part of what Cedric is talking about when he's talking about being comfortable in uncomfortable spaces. And, we need to recover those memories and recognize not just for the sake of talking about it, but so that we are inspired to act on it and informed about how to act. I think, I study social movements, and they always depend upon oppositional consciousness. We have a consciousness of the problem. And so much of the reason I think we have to talk about this, 1898, and so much else, and part of why I wanted to talk about how 1898 is not exceptional. It's not an aberration. It is fundamental to this nation's identity as a white democracy. It is a moment we're most aware of because there has been this dialogue and there has been the creative work, the films, the websites, the commissions. And so we can talk about 1898 in a way we can't talk as much about some of the other atrocities that have been of the same sort. I think that I'm encouraged by this moment, and I don't think it's a forever moment. I think there's a moment that this particular crisis we're in right now with the pandemic and the collapse of the economy and the mass incarceration, the death spiral of environmental destruction. There is an opening right now to reckoning that I think Wilmington as a community can play a really important role, and it already is, but can continue to play an important role in pushing the nation, pushing the state into a deeper commitment to this work. And our very survival depends upon it. I mean, if you think about all of the ways this has, the idea that this is a white country, that 70 million or so people voted for a candidate for president who both demonstrated himself incompetent and ran very explicitly on a white supremacist platform, promising to keep America white. 70 million Americans put their support behind that figure, apparently, and so I think somebody in the chat asked if there's one thing you would take away. I would stress in my own case that we have to, in my own community here in St. Louis, when Francis McIntosh was lynched by free man of color was lynched by a white mob in 1836, after which the abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy was assassinated because of his protest of the mob violence and the impunity. Abraham Lincoln spoke before he was president about how, this is 1837, if there is impunity for racial terror, we can forget about the republic. We can forget about the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of the law. And we see that has proven true. But what St. Louis, the white power elites in St. Louis said was, let's lower the veil of oblivion over this case, because it is too difficult to talk about this atrocity where they burned this man alive outside the courthouse in St. Louis. It is too difficult to talk about, so let's just lower the veil of oblivion. And we keep doing that. The country, we're not mostly talking. Most of us are not talking about 1898 at all. And so I just want to defend the dialogue, because I think is an important part of action. And sometimes the two get too sharply separated, in my opinion.
Thank you, Jeff. Who would like to close us out with the final word? Anybody? Well, I will then, and I just want to thank you all for being part of this community, for being leaders here, even if you don't live here. I thank you for your talents. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your devotion. I thank you for your intelligence. I thank you for your passion. I thank you for being part of this vibrant community that needs a reckoning. We need a reckoning here, and it's time. So thank you. And if you care to support the petition, feel free to sign it. It was delivered to city government last month. I haven't had a reply yet. No surprise. We're going to keep trying though. So thank you all very much, and reach out if you want to participate in any of those actions. So thank you very much, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Cook, for providing this platform for us to be able to be vocal. Appreciate you.
And thank you all for helping Wilmington to continue and try to make steps going forward, not backwards.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for all the work y'all do.
Thank you, Cedric. So. Good job, Lucy.